Welcome, everybody, to October Lunch and Learn 2024. Today we have a treat in store. We have Ashley Busby. Ashley is a studio artist, a professional artist living in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Recently moved from New York across country, and she is an advisor at UNM and got her MFA from Texas Tech. And today she is going to talk to us about investigations that she's been making into the mark making process in Lower Pecos rock art. So very excited for her to give us some really interesting, fascinating information today. So Ashley, take it away.
Well, thank you so much for introducing me, Jessica. And I just wanted to welcome everyone to October's Lunch and Learn. And thank you for joining us. And I want to take a moment to thank Shuma for providing the resources that made this talk possible and the opportunity to share some of my research today. This afternoon, I'm going to be exploring some of the developments made by Lower Pecos artists in their art. And this is going to include some comparative analysis of the Fate Bell site. And I'm also going to give some preliminary studies that I've made of the Rattlesnake Canyon composition. I wanted to start today just sharing a little bit about my background. In my studio art practice, I explore how we represent landscape, and I use a lot of different materials and surfaces. And through my research with Shuma, which has also really enhanced my own studio practice, I experience a lot of things when I study these murals, mainly thinking about the painting process of these artists. I began working with Shuma in 2016 through a graduate internship, and I've had the pleasure to continue working with them. Most recently, I've collaborated with the Shuma team for the Hearthstone project, and through this, I've been able to conduct some art analysis of the murals on site. So I've been able to study composition and types of mark making the artists use to understand the importance of painting as a vehicle for expression for the Lower Pecos narrative. I like to begin just with a little context because I know not everyone has an understanding of kind of some of the developments of art. And I like to just go over briefly just how some artists, other artists have seen and portrayed their world through visual art. So here you can see in the Gothic period, artists use flat backgrounds and gold flake and symbolism to represent the value of religious imagery. Here you can see how the Renaissance painters use point perspective and vanishing points that allow the viewer to geometrically experience space on a flat surface. And then later in history, you can see how artists use different intensities of color and value to represent depth, like for instance, in this Rembrandt painting. Later on in history, you'll see how artists began to really experiment with color and light, like the Impressionist artist. And rather than trying to recreate some intense realism, they were trying to create natural light and color through their painted mark. And so you can see through this, throughout history, artists have used a lot of different methods and systems for painting and creating, conveying their own cultural concepts through the way that they made their art. So there's centuries of this research that really dives into Western art developments, but there's so many early and prehistoric works of art that lack this kind of analysis and scholarship. So in my work, I'm going to use some of the words that we describe Western art with. So for example, I'm going to use shape, line, form, and color. And while we can't say for sure that the Lower Pecos artists saw their art and process in this way, these are just words I'm using as a vocabulary to describe what we see in the paintings based on our understanding of art. And through studying these visual elements and how they're executed in the composition itself, we can learn about how the Lower Pecos artists saw and represented their world through these implements. So just a little context, the focus of this talk is going to be on the pictographs of the Lower Pecos Canyonlands located in Southwest Texas and Northern Mexico, and noted by the red circle on this map. And due to a unique combination of ecological and geological factors, rock shelters in the Lower Pecos contain some of the best preserved remnants of hunter-gatherer ways of life. As a result, this area is regarded as a highly significant archaeological region. The rock art of this region, found in the canyon shelters, is incredibly preserved, and through the research done by the Hearthstone Project, Shumla has demonstrated that these murals date back up to 5,000 years. And here you can see the 4 styles that are painted in this region. I'm going to be focusing on the Pecos River style here. The Pecos River style murals of this region really vary in size. So some are huge, some are up to 100 feet wide, 20 feet tall. And to paint these high areas up on the rock wall, a type of scaffolding would have been essential. So here you can see an image of Black Cave where there's a group of figures at the very top here. And then on the right, you can see the detail of the crisp lines and dots that would have required the artist to be up close to that surface to paint. And then here you can see the custom scaffolding that Shumla uses in the field. And this is an image from Fate Bell where they were collecting data. In addition, the color order that the artists used was highly significant to the structure of these works of art. Microscopic images of paint layers using Dynalite digital microscope have shown a consistent order of white over yellow over red over black, as seen in this example above. And knowing the order of paint layers is essential for understanding the complexity of these compositions. So not only did the artists weave together their compositions with a specific paint order, but they also used different combinations of line and form to create their murals. These murals required a lot of time and preparation from the artists for their painting materials. So the artists would have collected their materials from the landscape around them. This would have been earth pigments, binders from animal fat, and emulsifiers. And then sticks of different sizes would have been fashioned into brushes using probably plant fibers or animal hair, allowing the artist to create different thicknesses and qualities of line. So it's clear from the amount of preparation involved, the finding a significant location, building scaffolding to reach up high areas on the panel, collecting painting materials from the landscape around them, and then developing all of these motifs and images to express their narrative, that these paintings were not arbitrarily made. These works of art would have taken days, if not weeks, to prepare for and plan out, keeping within that specific color order of white over yellow over red over black. They utilized precious resources and underwent great physical effort to create these works of art. While visiting these sites in person through the Hearthstone Project, I've studied a unique combination of painted features up close. So by observing the edge of a line or the way a mark is applied to the surface, I've been able to simulate these kinds of marks in my own studio tests to discover more about the processes the artists might have used to create these visual elements. And recreating aspects of these paintings, I can see how the artists constructed each type of mark to become essential components of their compositions. This information is significant for understanding not only how the Lower Pecos artists made their art, but it's also a really important lens for my research. Today, I'm going to be talking about 2 sites that have been a central part of my compositional study. And I'm going to compare how the artist uses different kinds of brush marks at the Fate Belt site first, using either controlled lines or active gestures to create a specific quality in the scene. And then later on, I'm just going to share some preliminary findings from Rattlesnake Canyon. This is going to include some examples of the line work and then also some splatter application. This is a measurement map that I created while I was visiting Fate Belt in 2022. And this has been really important to my studies in the studio. So on site, I used a ruler and a tape measure, and I was able to take some pretty precise measurements of how figures were spaced and identify some key areas of symmetry. And this helped me identify the importance of repetition and intervals of negative space to create relationships between these figures. In this prominent group of figures located far left at the Fate Bell shelter, I was able to identify 2 key instances of symmetry from the center of this winged anthropomorph who's marked in yellow here. That's the center. And then you can see the inside of the wings are the same distance apart, as well as the outside of the wings are as well, they're the same distance apart as well. And on the right side of the panel, you can see some evenly spaced figures here. When I measured them on site, they were about 86 centimeters apart, and they hover above this wavy serpentine line here. And this even spacing would have required some form of a measuring tool or method just to ensure that the same distance was kept between each figure. Another example of measured spacing is seen inside the body of the wing central anthropomorph figure. And using D-stretch, I was able to enhance the image with different colors, and you can see 4 circular shapes inside the body. These are each 5 centimeters wide, and they're also 5 centimeters apart, which indicated to me that the painter likely used a circular shape to paint the ring itself, and then used that same shape to space the circles apart. And these are just a couple of instances of showing the intention and planning on behalf of the artist and the importance of symmetry in their compositions. Here you can see an example of the Fate Bell artist arranging figures to give the illusion of depth. These 5 figures surrounding A1 have feet pointed in different orientations, and their bodies are rendered with different angles to convey their positioning around the central winged anthropomorph. And by rendering form in different perspectives and layering these figures in front of and behind A1, the artist demonstrates their ability to push and pull figures into the space to create depth. Completing the scene, you can see A1's feet facing forward, and it just indicating his central positioning in the circular path, which creates a really powerful narrative between these figures. Although there's hundreds of figures at Fate Bell, I was really interested in this other group of figures located near the center of the large shelter, circled here. And this scene shares a lot of motifs and types of imagery, and just serves as a really great point of comparison between how the artist can make different kinds of marks. So when I was looking at this winged anthropomorph, you can see a really wonderful example of how the artist uses different kinds of brushwork and paint saturation to create different effects. So you can see here the fine lines of the antler tines. They have really crisp edges and they're very finely executed. And then comparing that to the streaky overlaid lines across this anthropomorph, which indicates movement, that sweeping action from the top left of the figure to the bottom of the right wing. And this thick diagonal mark creates a sense of motion, leading the eye of the viewer to a cluster of dabs of paint above the figure's head. This is an oil painting I did because I was really curious about how the artist layered the red on top of that like brushy mark on top of the fine lines. And so I painted the anthropomorph first in this test, and it took around 10 hours to dry before I was able to apply the brushy lines on top. This is a detail of, I tried to apply the brushy line on top of that really finely executed antler right after painting it, and you can see how it kind of smeared the paint and the mark underneath is not visible. And so according to this test, it indicated that to me that the artist would have carefully planned when they applied this paint to ensure that the layers underneath were dry, to make sure that they could maintain the integrity of the mark if they were layering on top of it. The artist also utilized some splatter application of paint in this scene. So underneath this figure, I've circled a close-up of some mist-like splatter application. And this is located primarily within this wavy serpentine line around the form. And this fine splatter application speckles across this entire area around this, this figure. And this likely would have been applied by either blowing pigment through a hollow instrument, or in the case of some of my studio tests, it was made by flicking the bristles of my paintbrush. And when I was looking at this splatter up close, I noticed that the dots were kind of sparse and spread out. And just from my own splatter paint tests, I suspected this was because the artist was farther back from the rock wall, but I did want to test this. So I did this first test where I was about 6 inches from the surface doing the mist splatter application. And then the second test, I was about 3 feet from the surface. And here you can see the difference, this image on the top, it's much more concentrated. While this image here, this test where I was farther away, has a more dispersed splatter, and it's more similar to this splatter on the right that was present in the scene. And so this indicates the importance of proximity to the surface as part of the artist's process. Either farther back or closer changes the way that the marks are made on the surface. In this de-stretched image, you can see the splatter a little more clearly. So it's in here and then throughout here. But you can also see that on the outside that there's no splatter. And this indicates that the artist would have blocked off the area outside of the serpentine line to ensure that the splatter did not fill this area. And again, so proximity to the surface becomes another component of the artist's painting process and how they anticipate and plan to create a desired effect or mark, and also how to localize it in one place. On the left part of the scene, there's just a couple of examples of how the artist disguises or leaves evidence of the brush they use. So in this figure's foot in profile, you can see the artist choosing to keep the brushy ends of the mark visible right here on the ends of the toes. And then I was comparing this with the line underneath this figure here. And you can really see the crisp edge of this line, the precision and care to define the edge of this. And so it shows the kind of different types of marks carry different intention. One can be very specific and controlled, and the other implying more action or movement or expressiveness. And then what really fascinated me about this scene, comparing with the other scene that I was just talking about earlier in the presentation, was these two figures in particular. They're very similar, and to me that indicated that one was probably modeled or shaped after the other. So both of these figures are front-facing winged anthropomorphs with antler tines, and they have front-facing outstretched hands. And both of the wings on each figure have a serpentine line that runs through the middle, and they have a series of single poled ladders at the bottom curve of their wings. Interestingly, when I was studying these up close, when I was on site, I noticed that there was a really fine gap, if you get really close up to it, between the serpentine line and the colors blocked around it. And this indicates an intentional space that the artist left to make sure that these colors didn't touch. So according to the color order, the black would have been painted, and then the red would have been painted around this. And the artist would have intentionally left this negative space here and here to make sure that they had room to apply that yellow line. And again, just showing that intention and the planning with each layer that the artist made for these figures. And although these figures are painted in likeness of each other, the artist renders them differently, which I found very interesting. In this anthropomorph here, you can see a series of gestural lines. They're painted around the wings of the figure, and then they're also in this negative space around the figure. And the other anthropomorph, there's fewer gestural lines, but they're going across the body of the painted, and they're just painted directly on top of this figure. And an important feature on both of these anthropomorphs are the series of dots either on or around their head. So on this figure, you see a series of very carefully painted black dots at the tip of each antler tine. And on this other figure, you see the dots are more gesturally painted around the figure's head. And they have this appearance of like being released into the space. And just to note, the dots are also red. It's a color associated with life and fire. And when looking at this, I feel like the meaning really aligns with the way that these marks were applied to the surface with this more expressive application of paint. So again, while these figures do look alike, I think it's really important to note how the artist approaches painting them very differently. Whether it's a crisp edge of a line or a fine dot, you can see the detail and intention of the artist when they're rendering this form. And then alternately, the artist can use some really brushy, energetic lines, and that really reveals their process and kind of that immediacy of the painted mark. With future study, I really want to explore how the scenes at Fate Bell are arranged in this really dramatic morphology of this huge site. I made a very quick sketch because it's kind of hard to tell from the photos. But circled here is where that grouping of figures is located. And you can see there is a part of the rock wall protrudes forward and creates a flat surface. So this is where the paintings are located, and then this is where the surface kind of juts out, creating a flat part of here where the artist chose to create their scene. And it just makes it more visible and prominent. And then right above this scene is another grouping of figures. So here you can see where the rock wall curves up into an overhanging ceiling. And this is a location of dozens of huge figures. They're larger in scale, and they span up really high on the rock surface. So that indicated to me that the artist probably used some type of scaffolding to reach this area of the surface. And I think Fate Ball is a great example of how the artist can adjust size and scale of figures, or even location of their scenes, just depending on what part of the rock wall they're using. And the paintings change with the site, and they take on meaning through how they interact with the physical space itself. So every component, whether it's the paint or the physical surface, becomes part of the composition. And I wanted to wrap up today just with a few preliminary findings of another site that I'm going to be studying in depth. Through some images taken on site by Shuma, I was able to begin my analysis of the Rattlesnake Canyon mural and identify some key compositional elements that I really want to go in more depth with. So I'm going to talk about some of those figure relationships and some areas that I plan to collect more data. So just a little information on Rattlesnake Canyon. It's a huge mural. It spans about 30 meters in length. And this is a map that I made featuring the arrangement of figures on the Rattlesnake Canyon mural. And I've marked the approximate center with this green line here. And I know it's a lot of lines, but essentially I was just trying to map out where the main anthropomorphs were staggered throughout the panel and how the artist created variation in the scene. So on the outer right and left of the panel, you can see how the figures are much higher and lower on the panel here. And then as you near the center, the figures follow a more even path. So there's a much narrower range of vertical space that the artist is using. And so this creates just a prominent shift in the painting where vertical space is decreasing as it nears the center of the mural. I identified some key areas of symmetry and some opportunities for more study. So in the center of the panel, approximately, this is a really prominent group of figures here. So these two symmetrical figures face each other. And then another element of symmetry can be seen with a series of 6 dots between these two prominent figures. And while they do appear to be symmetrical, this is something that I would like to measure in person if I'm able to collect more data. The artist uses a series of wavy lines here in the center to arrange the space. And this serves as a visual anchor and becomes kind of a center point for the symmetry of the right and left figure here. And there's also a couple of other wavy lines that are to the left of this figure that just help organize the space and create a relationship between the figures. When thinking about the painting process, and especially when I was studying some of these types of lines and forms at Rattlesnake Canyon, I was thinking about a quote that I really love. We consider lines as paths of action, records of energy left by moving points. And I was thinking about that, especially when I was comparing these two parts of the center of Rattlesnake Canyon. So on the left side, you can see this long dart, and it implies movement as the artist paints that line diagonally across the surface. To the right, though, you can see a really different use of line work. This is a series of finely painted darts that are evenly spaced and controlled to a specific region. And so rather than that long line action across the surface, these darts create a pattern that frames this figure. So that really the duration and the type of line can imply either movement or structure, depending on how the artist wants to render it. Splatter paint, which has been a really big part of my recent research, is present throughout this composition, interacting with the figures and filling the negative space. And so rather than directly applying paint to the surface, the artist is preserving their own movement through the impact of paint that they apply from a distance. So here you can see a great example of splatter paint below the torso of this figure. And this splatter path would have taken a lot of passes from the artist flinging paint onto the surface directly. The artist's movement in applying these splatter marks becomes part of the figure's action as well, giving this figure the illusion of propelling upward. And the splatter is also targeted to this pretty narrow region indicated here, showing that the artist likely blocked off the sides to ensure the specific vertical path and to make sure the splatter didn't get outside of that. The artist of Rattlesnake used a great amount of splatter paint on the right side as well. And above this figure is a really good example of a strong splatter path that's created from below. With a powerful movement of the arm extending upward, the artist was able to create some of these more dramatic paint trails. So here's a close-up of that here. And studio tests that I've conducted show, let me bring that up. So I attempted to recreate some of these high up splatter trails, but I had to be much lower down from the surface and fling the paint above. And so that's another indication of the artist kind of changing their proximity to the surface and their orientation to the panel to create different kinds of marks. So the motion is recorded in these splatter trails. The painting process then becomes part of how we interpret this figure and its dynamic presence on the panel. Splatter paint is just the beginning of what I want to research at Rattlesnake Canyon. This is one of the densest layering of figures that I've seen from the panels that I've been able to study. And it has some of the most intricate line work and layering of forms of color. And with future work, I'm going to begin to break down some of these figure interactions and understand how the artist chose specific lines and types of paint application to create a unique combination of form and color that create this complex part of the mural. And that concludes my presentation for today. I just want to say thank you everyone for listening. And I want to thank Shumala again for all their support. And I was hoping we could have some time for comments and questions.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much. Really fascinating stuff. And we do have some questions in the chat. So some of these I may be able to answer as well. This first one, for example, what date is I think ascribed. I see, Mark's what you're asking. What date is ascribed to Fate Bell paintings? We have not yet dated Fate Bell, so we don't know for sure. But we are doing some research with the Hearthstone dates that we have gotten to see if there's a connection with motifs, and you'll have that those studies and publications are yet to come. So I can't yet make any determinations there, but certainly very old. Next, we have Margaret Barrier asking about why bear's ears and not feline ears. That sounds like a Carolyn question to me.
Yeah, when I was reading some of the papers, they were referenced as bear-like ears, but I guess they could be feline-ish ears.
Yeah, that's right.
Just a
That's true.
little.
Yeah, the kind of rounded ears. So yeah, perhaps feline would be a better term to use for that. All right, Dan Massey. He says, today different paint formulations and binders have different drying times. Have you tested this aspect with the likely paint formulations used by the original Pecos River style painters?
That's a great question. I know Carolyn's done some experiments with collecting materials on site to recreate what the paint formula was. In my studio tests, I use oil paint just because oil and fat-based paint, I think, probably have a similar way of when the artist applies it and the way it looks on the surface. But there was most likely a different drying time than the materials I'm working with. But that's something I really want to explore in the future, is getting on site and using some of the materials from the Lower Pecos area.
That would really be incredible to see, the paint formulations that they've come up with involving the agave juices and the possibly deer bone marrow or other types of fats. Would be fascinating just to do an archaeological experiment about yeah, the different kinds of paints and what they would look like. Um, Kate York asked, the action and movement and expression of the strokes makes me think of narrative storytelling through art. Like, I wonder if the artist had any performance element to their art, like making the process of the strokes and the timing of the layering as an element of the total work. Do you think that might be a reasonable assessment?
I love that idea. When I was studying this, I was really thinking about like the physical constraints that the artist might have had when they were, reaching up to a high area of the panel, or the amount of effort or precision. And so, yeah, I almost felt kind of like this was an act of reverence in making it. I don't know if it could be called a ritual, because I don't know if it was thought of in that way, but something like each layer, each stroke, each movement made by the artist becomes part of the performance, which becomes the art. So yeah, it's an act of creation.
Yeah, would be fascinating to know. And certainly drawing times between the different color layers and things, if there were rituals or songs or dances or things that went along with the, I mean, it stands to reason that there would have been. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. Another question from Kate. The clustering of figures in Rattlesnake Canyon seems very much like a perfect but natural cluster. Fascinating, she said.
Yeah, it's amazing how coherent they are, just knowing how much time and planning went into making the art, how like almost seamless they look when they come together, just like, and then thinking about the weeks and the time and the preparation that went involved in that. So I think that's just another, it's just more proof of the skill of the artist to create something very cohesive and something visually coherent.
Hmm. Truly, I mean, the size of Rattlesnake alone, I think, don't quote me, but I think it's 150 feet across. I mean, it is enormous,
I think
compositional,
about 4 meters tall, no, 3.5 meters tall, I think. It's
something,
enormous.
scaffolding, the amount of paint that it would have taken. I mean, it truly is, it boggles the mind. And I'm not an artist, so I can imagine, Ashley, in your position thinking, like, just how much energy and how much effort it would take, even to just go to the store and buy that much paint, much less make it yourself.
Right, right, exactly.
Um, from S. Avila, amazing art scene at Rattlesnake. Truly, truly, Rattlesnake is something else, and it is a site that we are hoping and planning to actually work more on for some full documentation in the coming years. So stay tuned for more news on that.
Yeah.
Paul Fehrenbach, have you been able to identify an individual artist's paintings in more than one location?
That's a great question. I think that's was really on my mind when I was looking at the Fate Bell scenes and comparing that one was made in likeness of the other, but really seeing how different stylistically they were. Um, in a site like Rattlesnake Canyon, though, it had to have been more than one painter. I don't know if that could be possible by one person. But I think when you start to compare some of the marks, you can see where either several artists used the same tool, or one artist used, just one artist painted the figure. Um, but yeah, I think that's a really great question, is kind of learning more about how specific figures are painted, and like if there's like authorship, or if everything is just like a shared kind of communal activity and they're all, participating in the act of creating.
Yeah, something that all of the research that Shimla has done to gather all the imagery through Alexandria Project and Hearthstone might be something that someone could study even sort of remotely by using the images.
Mhm.
So yeah, so many questions to be answered. Marx asked, please explain how to tell between splatter and applied paint.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So when it's flung from like when you see the splatter trails, I wasn't able to get a close up from Rattlesnake Canyon of this, but around the edge of the dot, you can see where the paint kind of ricochets
Mm.
out. So you'll see like kind of almost like where it like splashed out from the point of impact. And especially when you see like that trail of paint, you'll see kind of how that brush was like kind of flung up and then the paint gets applied onto the surface. For mist splatter paint, I would say it's the concentration and kind of the variation of the dots. So they're very fine. They almost look like speckled. And sometimes you see it in combination with directly applied paint, but just from the coverage of the surface area and like the consistency of that really fine speckled paint indicates to me that it would have been applied through a splatter application.
Awesome. I was looking to see if I could pull up a example super quick, but I think also, how do you know that they didn't just come with a paint brush and put dots
Mhm.
because of that look?
Yeah, it's I think did I include the splatter test? I think I included my splatter test in here. I can bring that up again. But just when I conducted it in the test in my studio, I was able to kind of replicate that approach. And there's just something about the consistency of it and the quality of the paint that indicates that, to me at least, from my experience painting, that it was a splatter paint application. But I think
Cool.
there is an example at another site where you can see it in combination. So I'll try to put that in my next presentation because that's also a really interesting idea. Like the artist choosing to directly apply paint onto the surface, but also like removing themselves from the physical surface and applying paint from a distance. And I think
Yeah,
that could be a really interesting like comparative study.
so interesting. I was sure I could, while you were talking, I could find a good example. Because you kind of have to see it up close to really see the
Yeah.
difference.
In my last
Um,
presentation, I did a pretty thorough breakdown of the different splatter types. So if you get a chance to go onto
oh
the
yeah,
YouTube
go back
channel,
to the YouTube.
I've
Yeah,
got an example. I broke them down into categories unofficially of the fine splatter, splatter trail, and then clusters of splatter, along with some of my studio tests.
awesome. All right, I will stop looking now, but yes, go back to the YouTube. All right, next question. Um, Kate, what are the next steps? Will you look at more specific creatures in the piece or different locations? What can we look forward to coming soon?
Yeah, next step would be getting hopefully some more detailed images of rattlesnake and studying the splatter. I'm really interested in learning why the artist chose specific locations and how the splatter is interacting either with the negative space or with the figures themselves. So I would like to isolate and then like kind of relayer the splatter on top just to see specifically what that action is doing in the scene. Um, but yeah, that's kind of where my head's at. But I would also really love to do more analysis of line work and comparing some of those more gestural lines with the specific lines and um, trying to identify kind of the intentionality behind that and how it changes either the energy or the movement in the scene or the interaction between the figures.
Feels like we need to get you a studio with a giant limestone wall. You
Exactly.
can try all the things.
Right.
Steve Davis asked, have you noticed the similarities between anthropomorphic figure shape and natural staining patterns on canyon walls? Is it possible that those natural stains are part of the artist's inspiration?
That's a great question. We do see staining in some of the murals. Like there is a little example of that in Rattlesnake. It's above one of the figure's head where you can see the artist stains the paint and then applies lines on top of it. So you definitely see that happening intentionally in some of the murals. As far as natural stains, I can definitely see the artist being inspired by that. Like the paintings are part of the natural surfaces they're on. So I think the artist does see these things as, you know, living through time, as being enacted by the space around it. Um, that's something I'm really interested in studying with more about the morphology of the scenes of how, you know, the artist incorporated natural features into the paint itself. Whether it's like a protruding surface or if it's you know, a break in the wall and incorporating that into the artwork. And we do see examples of incorporation, whether that sometimes it's like a little hole or a crack or part of the rock wall that shifts dramatically where the artist will change the way they paint around it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That's especially visible at White Shaman when the large figure in the center, the head is kind of on a platform where that white line goes, and it
Yeah,
just yeah, it's such a
yeah, it's amazing.
so cool. Jenny Grayson asked, "What type of paint did you use versus the type of paint the original artist would have used? Did you make a similar paint?"
Oh, yes.
What happened?
Yeah, in the future, I definitely plan on recreating paint using the materials that would have been accessible to them. But in my studio tests, I primarily use oil paint just because of it's oil and fat have similar, I guess, consistencies in the way that paint is. And then, yeah, then I would like to kind of explore what they would have used and see kind of what those dry times would be.
Awesome. Um, Kate said, "Love the gesture lines and the energy, movement, interaction. So excited."
Me
Yay.
too.
Dan said, "All artists need to learn to practice before they execute an expensive or formal work. Have we ever discovered wall surfaces in that region that seemed unfinished or experimental or practice oriented?"
That's a great question. That I'm not sure about. I know there's evidence of under like sketching in some of the sites where the artist would like map out. Um, but I don't know if
I
we
I
found
can
anything.
say that, yeah, I mean, thus far, to our knowledge, none of the sites that we have visited seemed to be a practice. And I wonder if Carolyn would say, that part of the reason for that is because when you paint, you are giving life. You are putting energy and true power into these images, and to create something on the wall like that, maybe without, the full ability or the full power behind it, perhaps might not have been a good idea. But I agree with you. There had to be some kind of practice. So maybe perhaps on um, hides, or I mean, who knows? And I'm
Mhm.
sure someone does. So that is
Yeah,
a great question, and a really interesting thing to think about. I certainly don't come out of the womb knowing how to do this incredible art. So
right.
where are these practices? Yeah.
I think that's another really great point is that these were shared skills. And so when the artists created, it was, it was usually a collaborative process where that's why we see the motifs happening in so many different sites. We see the same kinds of forms and figures and lines. So I think there's something to that about like where they would have taught or practiced, or whether that was informally on a, you know, piece of vegetation or on skins or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Mark's asked, do we have any idea of the materials used for scaffolding? I can say we believe that it was, different kinds of wood that could have been gathered in the canyon bottoms, and also probably the stronger or thicker of the sotol stalks, and those types of stalks that we see, as well as just creating cordage, which would have taken a lot of work
Yeah.
to harvest all of those leaves and to prepare them, get the fibers out, create the cordage, and strap together all of these various things to create that scaffolding. So that's another big step of effort, and time and calories spent, to
Hmm.
do this art. Phil Salvador asked, "Do you notice the use of rock topography like bulges and depressions to give figures a 3D feeling?"
I think we definitely see that when there's examples of incorporation within the figure itself. The artist will paint around a hole to make a mouth, for example. Um, from my studies at Fate Bell, I mainly think of that surface where it flattens, where the artist painted that scene, and then you see the depression in the rock wall behind it, and then it curves back. But that's definitely something I'm looking at going forward is specifically how the artist is using any kind of morphology or, something that's happening with the rock surface itself um, to give a different quality to the figure or to activate that figure in the space.
I think we see too that they're using actually artistic means to show kind of a 3D, or a depth of fields.
Mhm.
Sometimes we see smaller figures, and perhaps those were painted in that way so that a larger figure appears foregrounded and a smaller figure appears backgrounded.
Mhm.
Um, but if we look at it as though it's just a 2D image, it just looks like large and small.
Right.
So that's something that someone like you, Ashley,
Yeah, but again, I think that's like the importance of it being in this physical space with this undulating surface. And so you can really get that sense of figures being pulled back and pushed forward by the artist.
yeah, absolutely. Well, that looks like the end of our questions in the chat. People are saying lovely presentation, fascinating presentation. So lots of love for you, Ashley. Thank you so much for being here with us. Do we have any last questions before we let Ashley go?
Yes, I would like
Oh,
to ask
yeah,
her a couple
yeah.
questions.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
Back to Fate Bell, in the triad panel, would you think that that entire panel was painted by one artist?
Based on the size, I suspect it was. I
Yeah,
think that that could have been executed by one artist, and the line work is so consistent through that group. Just studying it, and even just the application of the paint and some of those more solid areas. Um, I suspect it was one artist.
yeah. And also comparing the two winged figures that you took a close look at, do you think both of those were painted by the same artist?
I can't say for sure on that. I am pretty confident that they were modeled after each other, but because they're painted so differently, the smaller one is so much more expressive in that line work around. And I do think that there were different painting tools involved. So it could have been the same artist using different painting implements, and it could have been two different artists. It's hard to tell. The red does look a little more, I don't know, it looks more saturated on that side, and that could be just because of accretion. So yeah, there's a lot of factors there that I can't be sure, but I do know that they're probably in likeness of each other.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it
Thank
would be
you.
fascinating to be able to radiocarbon date the two and see if
Yeah,
they
Mhm.
are, consistent in terms of time.
yeah.
Maybe. Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Ashley. That was
Thank you.
fascinating. We
Thank you
can't
so
wait for
much.
more. Yes. And take care, everybody. We'll see you next month.
Yes, thank you, everyone.